In this fourth and last of the videos on the history of American literature, we'll look at the period after World War II, try to get up as close to the present as we can. Certainly after the long years of depression in World War II, people wanted stability, and the 1950s sort of provided it in some respects. It was a prosperous era, and the dominant culture stressed conservative values, the importance of the traditional nuclear family, the mother as a homemaker, and the father as provider. Academics soon noted the changing economy produced a conformist, prosperous culture. In 1956, William White published his study of a Chicago suburb of Park Forest, and he published the study known as Organization Man. And what he said was, before, when people had to struggle, this promoted a sense of individualism that the culture celebrated. Now, in the 1950s, the beginning of a land of plenty, the emphasis shifted to community and the group. So people were more focused, he argued, in the 1950s on belonging before. They just wanted to find their secure niche in the system because the system seemed to work. Quite a contrast to before. A famous psychologist, Helena Deutsch, published a best-selling book, The Psychology of Women, in the 1950s. In her book, following kind of from Freud, she argued that women had an intensified personality, sort of a conflict between motherhood and eroticism. She said that this gave women a unique ability to identify with others. Among the things she said was that women would be happier in more submissive roles. Now, her work was complex and in some ways foretold the women's rights movement, but the culture seemed to take it as she was telling women that happiness was found by being submissive. After the wars, the soldiers were home and the culture stressed sort of conformity and a period of economic prosperity. It all led to the famous baby boom, where the number of babies and the number of babies per capita both grew to the heights of American history. In 1957, for example, a baby was born in the United States every 7 seconds. Not surprisingly, therefore, one of the more popular books in the 1950s was a book by a doctor named Dr. Benjamin Spock, and he'd originally published the book Baby and Child Care in 1946, but it was a bestseller throughout the 1950s. In it, he argued parents didn't really need all of that rigidity with parenting, and you could it really was just about having stability with the child, the same face. Now, Spock also thought that it was usually women, but it didn't really matter as long as the person that was stable in the child's relationship was, always there, and that was needed. That was important for a child's development. Of course, not everything was quiet in the 1950s. I mean, look at the civil rights movement in the 1950s, for example. But even among, just in a broader cultural sense, there were the beginnings of the roots of what would become the rebellious 1960s. Some of the older baby boomers by the late 50s were called beatniks. They were sort of counterculture. They wore shades, and they sort of rejected the materialistic, ethos of the day, and they would sit in coffee houses and debate intellectuals, and some of them were writers, kind of like the Lost Generation in a way. One of the early leaders of the beatniks was the poet Allen Ginsberg. He spoke of Eastern religions and the problem of sexual repression and militarism and materialism. In 1956, he published the poem Howl, which actually led to an obscenity trial as it described heterosexual and homosexual sex. Ginsberg would later be a big part of a number of 1960s protests. Another leader of the beatniks was Jack Kerouac, who became known for his method of spontaneous prose. He wrote a number of novels, but perhaps his most famous is On the Road, loosely based on his travels across the U.S., working odd jobs and riding the rails and meeting interesting people and going to interesting places. Kerouac ended up dying of alcoholism at age 47 in 1969. Many young people reveled in the sarcastic and irreverent Mad magazine, first published in 1952. The magazine went on for decades and lampooned leading political figures and America's conformist culture. The magazine's fictional mascot, named Alfred E. Newman, was typically a focal point of the magazine's cover, usually replacing the celebrity or leader that was lampooned inside. If you look a little deeper beyond the beatnik culture, you can see the foundation for the 1960s kind of in other ways too. For example, foretelling the sexual revolution of the 60s was the publication of the Kinsey Reports. It was really two books of research on human sexuality, one for men and one for women. It was published in 1952 by Alfred Kinsey and several other researchers. No one had really studied sex as a true academic subject, and what it found shocked a lot of people. What he did, the books were based on the available data and interviews with thousands of people, and what he found was that 50% of men had some extramarital affairs, and homosexuality was much more prevalent than people said. Up to 10% of people were on a scale of homosexuality, and it's sort of opened people's eyes in a way that hadn't been seen before. Certainly the sexual revolution had roots well before the 60s. As the 1960s began, there was a dispute over the publication of the novel Lady Chatterley's Lover. It was a very descriptive bit of eroticism, and people thought it was pornography. One notable book popular in the 1950s was the playwright Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, first published in 1949. It won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama and a Tony Award for Best Play, and many people consider it one of the best plays of the entire 20th century. It told the story of a frustrated middle-class salesman. In 1953, Hugh Hefner began publication of his famous magazine Playboy, and the first cover had the actress Marilyn Monroe on its cover. Popular in the 1950s was J.G. Salinger's famous 1951 novel Catcher in the Rye. It sort of is the Bible of loners and people that feel alienated from society. If you think about Mark David Chapman, who shot John Lennon, the Beatles singer, he had a copy of The Catcher in the Rye with him when they arrested him. In 1953, Ray Bradbury published his famous novel Fahrenheit 451. That was the temperature 451 degrees Fahrenheit that books burned. It was a novel about America where books were outlawed, and firemen would be the ones to burn the books. And he tells the story of a guy that was a fireman that was becoming disillusioned with burning his books, with burning books, and set about to preserve literature. In 1957, the writer Ayn Rand published her fourth novel in what she considered her magnum opus, the novel Atlas Shrugged. It is today sort of a very famous novel admired by conservatives. It told the story of a dystopian future where the government stifled all individualism, and the hero of the book eventually breaks away from this and all the government regulation, and it stresses again the individualism and away from the forced collectivism of society. On a lighter note, published the same year as Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, was Dr. Seuss's famous The Cat in the Hat. It was the first of a series of his children's books, and he was concerned about a lack of literacy in the television-centric 1950s, and he told a story of a cat that showed up at this young girl's house, Sally's house, and she let him in despite the fish that were upset, and the cat and his friends basically trashed the house, and it was a bestseller. It sort of had a rhyme that caught the children's attention, and like I say, led to a number of sequels. I mentioned earlier in one of the videos that uh, several presidents have been authors, and certainly I mentioned Teddy Roosevelt, who published those naval histories. Well, another book published by a president was John F. Kennedy's books. When he was in college, he published his senior thesis, Why England Slept, looking at why England wasn't prepared for the Nazis in World War II. And then later on, he did a book that actually won the Pulitzer Prize. It was written by his speechwriter, sort of ghost written, but it was called Profiles in Courage. And it looked at famous American political leaders from the past that had done what they thought was correct, even though it wasn't the popular thing to do. And certainly Profiles in Courage helped raise Kennedy's stature and helped him get elected president in 1960. Up until the 1960s, Americans had always looked at the natural resources as something to be developed. There were, of course, preservationists all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt's day, but the majority of people assumed that development of natural resources was good. In 1963, a wildlife biologist working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Rachel Carson, published a book called Silent Spring, and in it documented the problem of pesticides like DDT and its impact in the ecology. And many people have cited this best-selling book as the beginning of American environmentalism. People began to realize that perhaps constant development was not always good. Well, Rachel Carson didn't by herself create the modern environmental movement. It certainly contributed, and by a few years later, in 1970, there was the first Earth Day and the creation of the EPA and the beginnings of environmental regulations, which all kind of, again, historians go back and cite her book as sort of the beginning of this broader movement. Of course, when you think about the 1960s politically, you think of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, which was sort of the height of American liberalism, an activist government working to eradicate poverty, the famous war on poverty. And you wonder where Johnson got a lot of those ideas. Well, he read and admired a book by Michael Harrington called The Other America. It was first published in 1962. And it said, in the 1950s and 60s, everybody seemed to be doing well. Suburbs were growing, everything's booming. But forgotten was this layer of poverty in the inner cities and often in the poor rural areas. In spite of the country's poverty of wealth, there was still this persistent poverty, and they called it the Other America, and it influenced Lyndon Johnson, as I say, helped contribute to the rise of his Great Society. Among the many things the Great Society did were some of those environmental laws that Rachel Carson had wanted, but you do see immigration reform, and you see Medicare and Medicaid and public housing and the first public food stamps, and like I say, it was all designed to sort of eradicate poverty and have more of a just society, a great society. And Michael Harrington's book was very influential in that. You also think of the 1960s, you might think of the women's movement, and literature was very important in spreading that movement as well as environmentalism. The liberation of women meant breaking down barriers against equal rights. And Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, first published in 1949, arguably laid the foundation for the modern women's movement. It's interesting to look at the changing sexual attitudes in the American culture. For example, in 1962, the author Helen Gurley Brown published the book Sex and the Single Girl, which became a bestseller. It was a non-fiction advice book that encouraged women to be independent, including having a stable job and having casual sexual affairs with different sorts of men, sort of broaden your experience. Helen Gurley Brown, by the way, went on to transform the magazine Cosmopolitan into sort of a life manual for young career women, and that included a degree of sexual liberation too. Of course, the sexual revolution of the 1960s sort of culminated in the hippies' counterculture, free love. If it feels good, do it. You had the birth control pill out, and you had penicillin curing a lot of sexually transmitted diseases, and so it was a period of personal liberation sexually. The biggest factor probably spurring on the growth of American feminism was the publication in 1963 of Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique. It became an instant bestseller, eventually selling more than 1 million copies and went through 16 printings, and it was translated into 13 languages. Friedan was a middle-class girl from Illinois who won Phi Beta Kappa at Smith College, went on to graduate school at the University of California, Berkeley, but decided against going for a doctorate because her boyfriend frowned on it, and society said it was just too competitive. She got married and had kids, and she was happy, but she really wasn't completely satisfied, and then she decided to write the book. The book essentially called on women to enter the mainstream of American society and to fight for equality. She interviewed hundreds of women who said they had everything they were supposed to have, but they still weren't fulfilled. Sort of like, is this all? She blamed psychologists and Freudian psychoanalysis especially. Friedan clearly had touched a nerve. She said she loved her husband, she loved her kids, she realized what she's doing important, but is this all? With the book's success, Friedan, she clearly hit a nerve, and she went on the lecture circuit backing up her conclusions. She had found a huge constituency, middle-class women who, maybe flowing from the experiences in World War II, somehow just felt unfulfilled. They weren't independent. They felt like they could do so much more. With the popularity of her book, which was published in multiple languages and went through many editions, Betty Friedan established the National Organization of Women, which grew in the 1960s and 70s. Certainly sexual liberation and the women's movement for equal rights were indicative of the 1960s, but sex, drugs, and rock and roll, they're part of the counterculture. Drugs like marijuana, had become a staple of the counterculture by the 1960s. Almost as popular as marijuana was LSD, or acid, which was a drug that had been created by the Department of Defense as a potential truth serum, but people liked it because it transformed the way they perceived reality, and it became really a big hit in the late 60s. Really spreading the popularity of LSD, and I guess even drugs in a larger sense for the counterculture, was a book first published in 1953 by Aldous Huxley called The Doors of Perception. And he talked about the use of psychedelic drugs and transforming the way people perceived reality, and he spoke of it in a positive way. And if you're familiar with the rock group The Doors, they got their name for their band from Aldous Huxley's book. And of course, the 1960s were involved with the African American Civil Rights Movement. By the late 1960s, anger among a number of younger African Americans over continued economic and social inequality had transformed the nonviolent civil rights movement of Martin Luther King, you might be familiar with earlier. Among the new leaders was Malcolm X, and he took a different attitude than the nonviolent. He was sort of, you stand up and you fight fire with fire, and he, working with the writer Alex Haley, published his Autobiography of Malcolm X, and first published in 1964, which he outlined not only his life, but also the ideology he followed. I should note that at the end he adopted more traditional Islam and dropped some of the more angry racist overtones in his earlier life. There were other African American leaders in the Black Civil Rights Movement, even more angry. For example, Eldridge Cleaver published in 1968 his book Souls on Ice, which is very inflammatory and very much against the racist mistreatment of generations of blacks at the hands of whites. The civil rights movement wasn't just for blacks, it wasn't just for women. Hispanic and Native Americans fought for equal rights too. And in regard to Native Americans, there's the famous book by D. Brown, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, which was first published in 1970. As a matter of fact, the book's never gone out of print. It looked at the history of Native Americans in the West basically from the perspective of the Indians. The white man had always sort of seen Indians as being savages and sort of manifest destiny, social Darwinism is good that we sort of took over. But this looked at it from a different angle, and the Native Americans were noble. They'd been defending the land that they had held first, and white man comes in and breaks agreements and is sort of it looks at the history of the Native Americans in the West from a Native American standpoint, which was kind of revolutionary. I mentioned that the Malcolm X's Autobiography of Malcolm X was written by the writer Alex Haley. Alex Haley also wrote his Roots, which was first published in 1976 and traced his lineage back to Africa. The book became a bestseller and inspired a TV miniseries that was at the time one of the most watched television shows ever, based on the Roots, the saga of an American family by Alex Haley. Of course, by the 1980s, AIDS had ravaged the gay and lesbian community, and Randy Schilt's 1987 book And the Band Played On highlighted the fight against the AIDS epidemic and helped civil rights for gays and lesbians. Of course, so much recent literature is well known today, if perhaps less influential in the grand sweep of American history. Writers such as John Updike, Tom Wolfe, James Michener, Eric Siegel, among others, wrote bestsellers in the 1970s. Noteworthy was the emergence of the horror writer Stephen King, who wrote Carrie in 1974. King went on to write a great number of horror stories that made it into television and into the movies. In recent years, self-help books and diet books have constantly topped the bestseller list. Books like The Complete Scarsdale Medical Diet or I'm Okay, You're Okay. They were just the whole popular self-help sections in bookstores. In the 1980s, numerous books were notable, including Carl Sagan's Cosmos, first published in 1980, and which led to a TV series that helped for the first time sort of explain complex scientific questions in a popular and readable style. But people have said it created a whole new generation of scientists. Toni Morrison's Beloved, first published in 1987, was a novel about an escaped slave, and it won for Morrison the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1993 and has been called one of the best works of fiction in the last 25 years. There are, of course, many popular writers of the last couple of decades, including of note John Grisham, Anne Rice, who famously wrote a lot of vampire stories, Alice Walker, Tom Wolfe, and Tom Clancy, the latter, of course, who wrote the spy thrillers, and many others, too many to meet. Today, the New York Times bestseller list is considered the standard for determining popularity and sales success. Perhaps one of the greatest sellers in recent years was Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, released in 1997. The author, J.K. Rowling, had been destitute as she wrote it. With the many sequels and movies that followed, she prospered from the famous franchise and let's just say isn't destitute anymore. By the 1990s, book clubs grew in popularity where people would get together and pick a book to read and discuss it. It was encouraged by the television talk show host Oprah Winfrey, who had a famous book club and gave a lot of press to novels she liked. If you're going to talk about selling books today, of course, you have to notice that the online bookseller Amazon began in 1995. And it soon expanded, of course, from Amazon to just about everything, and it's one of the behemoths in the world today. Today, e-readers are popular, where you can download a book and read it on an electronic device. The question then is, at the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century, what's the future of the book? Some people say that the internet sounds the death knell for books, and you can certainly see that a number of bookstores are closing. Certainly, only the major chains might have a chance at surviving. But I'm a little more optimistic. I think people like to have books in their hands and bookshelves, and I don't think the book is quite so dead as they say. In any event, This concludes the fourth and final video on the history of American literature, this one focusing on the second half of the 20th century.